My name is Bria Brown. My pronouns are she and her. I go to Cibola High School, which is located in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And currently, I am a junior in high school. Before we start this webinar, I would like to give a little spill on YCD and our mission statement. So, YCD, which stands for Youth Celebrate Diversity, is dedicated to educating and empowering youth in order to advance inclusion and equity for all. We believe that education is a fundamental human right and one of the critical tools every young person needs to succeed in their life. We believe that change must come from within a community and not from outside sources. We are working toward a more just and equitable society that values every human being. We believe in the young people who will lead us to that vision. Hey, such a nice little spill. Now let's have an introduction of the guests of the webinar. Uh, would you like to go first, Becki?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. Yat A Becki Jones Dashidine. Totsuni Nishlan, Ashihan Bashishti, Majishkishi Dashiche do Tabahe Dashinale. Agot Ego Adzan Nishlan, Sehotso De Nashan. My name is Becki. I am Big Water, born for the salt people. That's why I'm so salty. And my maternal grandfather is Coyote's Pass, and my paternal grandfather is Water's Edge. I am a Diné woman, and I am from Sehotso, and this is how I introduce. I'm thankful to be here on this webinar with y'all. And my day job right now is I am a program manager for the Native Community Health Network at Planned Parenthood. What we do is community health work in the Four Corner area. We do primarily work with Indigenous populations, and we do sexual health education. We host talking circles for Native men, women, and cuties, and we do HIV testing. We're now certified to do syphilis testing as well. And yeah, we pretty much do everything that's like revolved around sexual and reproductive health. Um, and other than that, I'm also in school right now. I'm going into population health at UNM. And in my free time, I like to go to shows. I am in a band called Weed Rat. It's a punk band. It's a Navajo punk band, so that's pretty cool. And yeah, I'm just super busy all the time. So that's my life. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. I really liked learning the fact that you're in a band. That's cool. Sam, would you like to go next?
Sure. Make sure I'm not muted. Great. Sam Carwyn, she, her, hers. And so I am based in Colorado on Arapaho or Ute land. For me, this work really came out of doing the other side of it. So doing a lot of CPS work, working with people who'd either lost their kids at risk of losing their kids due to abuse and neglect allegations. And then I started doing more case management, worked in a DV shelter. And so I was always on the other side of it and went to school, got a degree, did all of that. And then I just kind of fell into a job doing education and doing some community engagement work. And that ultimately led to me doing reproductive justice and where I am now. So I do community-based sex ed with a focus on parents, youth serving providers, and adults with disabilities.
Thank you. Now it's time for the questions. So I know that both of you guys work with youth, and I wanted to ask, where do you feel that sexism pops up most in their lives?
I can go.
Like,
I think where sexism does pop up for young people, opportunities to be like autonomous and being able to make their own decisions. And I think that burden of making mistakes is placed heavily on like young women and femmes. Like since we're talking about sexual health education, I still feel that there's a huge stigma around teen pregnancy and teen birth rates, especially in New Mexico. There's so much shame for young parents. And there's a lack of also just education for young parents and like promotional education. There's a lot of prevention work, but there isn't, in my opinion, enough education around like prenatal health, what types of programs are available and accessible for young parents too. Um, that's where I feel sexism pops up for me.
Yeah, so I think the most obvious is in the media. So what you're seeing all across any form of media. So I think that that's often where young people are engaging in it, whether that be in the shows that they're watching, the TikTokers they're following, so on and so forth. And that leads to the next thing. So when I see these images, then I start to build my thoughts around who can do what based off of what I'm seeing. And then I start to engage in the sexist words and all of that. So for me, I think young people are seeing sexism not in media, whatever form of media we're looking at, not just one type of media.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree. Oh, sorry.
I was
You go
gonna
first.
add on to that pop culture really does play a big role in stereotyping, especially genders. You know, it's very stereotypical, and I feel like they rely on low self-confidence and the vulnerability that young people have, especially young girls and women with the beauty industry. And they play off of that and they capitalize off of it to make money.
Mhm.
Yeah, hold on. But I definitely agree with you with like media, because especially with like social media, it's so kind of, in a way, it's like, this is how you should be. Like, there's so many TikToks focused on like, oh, this is the makeup you should wear to be the cool girl, or like, if you want to be liked by other people, you need to eat this food, and it's definitely more aimed at women. I feel where it's very like, change yourself now, so we can
Mhm.
then accept you. And then going back to what you said, Becki, with like sex ed, it doesn't ever really talk about, well, from my experience, like talking about teen pregnancy is kind of just like, don't do it. Like, that's it. There's no help. There's nothing. It's just kind of like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this. It's so shamed focused. And I think that's just really tragic.
Mhm.
Um, but I do want to bring up, when we're talking about sexism, we're, well, from how I am envisioning it, is just like almost like misogyny. That's
Mhm.
what I'm picking up on from this conversation of like negative ideas and stereotypes about females or more feminine presenting people. But that's not just what sexism is. It's kind of just any stereotype or perception based on a gender. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just
And
wanted to throw that out there.
yeah, I mean, it's not popular, but men or males or masculine folks also experience sexism too. And I think there's a lot of gender stereotypes for men to look a certain way, to act a certain way. And I think with sex education too, the boys are just kind of looked at as just horny animals. And that's not their experience, right? That's not what they want to have labeled on them. But that's somehow like just the stereotype from like movies and pop culture.
Yeah. On that note, I remember I did a presentation probably years ago, and they were talking about like Me Too in education and what does that mean. And I just pulled some quotes. Glisten does they do the school climate survey, which is just about all the things. But I pulled out specific quotes around violence and sexism and some of that. And one of the kids had written in that he was told that boys can't say no. And just that idea of like how we're giving consent and who does or doesn't give consent. And I know we don't talk enough about the harm that happens to boys in those ways, especially our young boys, that they are actually more likely to experience harm than our young girls when they're children. And so for me, it's really making it equitable in how we're talking to people so that we're not letting anyone think this is the only way it looks, or this is the only way someone can engage in a relationship.
Yeah, and since we're on the like sex ed topic, I want to ask like, do you feel that the modern curriculum for sex ed is failing its students? And what are the ways it is failing its students or are failing the students?
Yeah, I'll jump in first if that's okay, Becki. I think the number one thing, and was kind of maybe implied a little bit earlier, is sex education focuses on everyone having sex and generally heteronormative sex. And so you don't really hear about asexuality, the idea that someone wouldn't want to engage in sex, or even demisexual. You don't talk about all the types of attraction. We only talk about sexual attraction. And so just really doesn't allow people to learn about all the ways that relationships can look for you and how you want to engage in them. I also think sex ed encourages kind of this toxic monogamy culture of, oh, if you're with one person and you just sleep with that one person, then you don't have to worry. And it really doesn't teach you the reality of how do I have conversations with people, regardless of what our relationship dynamic is. So for me, I think it's just not addressing the broad range of attraction and the broad range of how people can engage in relationships. And so it makes people think they're abnormal when what they're seeing and thinking and feeling is completely normal.
Yeah, I kind of had something like that. And I think just along with that is just how not the sex ed I teach and probably not what you teach, Sam, but there's still sex ed out there that's very heteronormative, and they still use gendered language when referring to sexual acts and behaviors. And I think that's what I'm proud of when it comes to our curriculum is that we try to keep it down to genitals or different sexual acts without bringing in gender so that we can try to be inclusive to all folks, despite, who's having sex. Um, and then also I think we, working in New Mexico, we do have high rates of abuse, high rates of sexual and domestic violence. And I think that kind of conversation is left out too. We do focus on healthy relationships and talking about consent and reducing sexual risk. But, a lot of these students come from homes where, they do experience a lot of trauma, being, they're they have parents who have violent relationships. So when I'm talking, since I do have a program that is native specific, we can talk about like historical trauma and how that affects people's relationships, and then also just trying to bring in a cultural sense to like what relationships look like and how we respect our partners, and when we respect our partners we're respecting ourselves, and just kind of how that is you know a a circle. And then also just if we're taking care of ourselves, we're taking care of our communities as well. Which I think is super important, like having that accountability, not just for yourself, but you're accountable to your community as well. And so we want to make sure that we're not making people feel bad about STIs because they do happen. And I think young people are just still in a state of, oh no, I can't, I'm too scared to go get tested. I'm too scared to have this conversation with my partner. And I think that's something that we have to normalize too.
Can I add one more thing? Is
Yes,
that
yeah.
okay? Or you want to jump in?
No, go ahead.
I think the other thing is we've made sex ed seem like it's only sex ed. And what I really want is people talking about what are the broad skills that sex education provides you. So I know how to communicate what I do and don't want and set boundaries. It doesn't just mean within sex, that means in our broader relationships as well. I know how to have tough conversations. I know how to think about what I want and what my goals are. There's not a curriculum that doesn't talk about what are your goals and then how does these things interfere with those goals. And no one talks about sex ed as goal development. And so for me, when I talk about sex ed and what I really want people to understand is we're teaching broad skills that can apply to people not only in this moment and not only to their sex lives, but apply to them throughout their lifespan if they're actually engaging in comprehensive quality sex ed to learn about how they make decisions, what they want and don't want, and how those skills can help them.
And that's what
That's
people are scared of, is they think we teach sex ed, automatically someone's going to go right after school and have sex. But this education is for folks who are, you know, maybe they are sexually active, maybe not, but we always try to remind them that, you know, this information can be useful for the rest of your life.
I totally agree with that. I'm thinking back on like my sex ed experience, and it was never actually focused on relationships and like learning how to communicate with other people. It was more just on the scare tactic. It's very like, don't get pregnant, don't get an STI. Like, it's so focused on the don't that it actually kind of doesn't really teach you much. Like, it doesn't explain different things where it's gonna help me in the long run. It's just like, oh, they just told me not to do this. Like, it's not very comprehensive or helpful in the long run.
Mhm.
Um, which is my next question is like, how can schools start working towards a more comprehensive and inclusive and just more just practical sex ed curriculum? I know you guys mentioned it a little bit.
Do you want to go first, Becki? Otherwise, I'll jump in.
You could go first.
I think, and I probably, there's different opinions on this, right? So everyone wants evidence-based curriculum. But what you're missing then is the timeline it takes to get evidence-based curriculum. So I can say, if you want to tell me what was the top song in 2000 versus the top song in 2023, you're probably not going to remember that. And so for me, what I really think is important is bringing in the media. So here's the shows that people are watching. Here's the music that people are listening to. And instead of it being something outside of the classroom, let's bring it in. There was an educator I used to work with, and he called it lyrics and life lessons. And they literally just looked at the lyrics of a song and were like, what is this song talking about? What is it promoting? What do you think? And I always love bringing in media when I'm teaching. And I'll be like, let's watch this show. Let's just watch this snippet of a show. Let's watch this snippet of a movie, because that's the media that young people are already engaging in. And they're already forming ideas of what's healthy and what's not based on that media. And so you're missing the opportunity to point out the good that's in the media, the good that's in the TV shows and the movies, and the toxic that's in it. So I think that's big for me. And then Becki's kind of already doing it. But a big piece for me is, how are we engaging the community? When we're talking to kids and talking to young people outside of the entire family network, then we're losing an opportunity for education. Because 9 out of 10 parents, that's not a real statistic, but 9 out of 10 parents also didn't get comprehensive sex ed. And so we have to be practical in saying, young people don't have this information, but likely their parents don't have it either. And so when they're going to a parent, or oftentimes going to an older cousin, what information are they getting? And so it really requires a broader model than just thinking sex ed can only be taught in a classroom by a person. It should be including peer education. It should be including other adults in their life outside of their parents. And it should be bringing the parents in rather than pushing them out.
Sam, that's exactly what I was going to say, was peer education and parent programming. Just because parent programming, you know, we come into the classroom once a semester. And so that information it might deteriorate over time. And so we want to make sure that young people have people they can go home to and have these conversations, a trusted adult and parents, you know, that would be ideal, to continue those conversations, to answer questions they might have. And then also just educating parents is important too. And unfortunately, a lot of, you know, older generations, Gen X and then Boomer, I don't know. But the older generations, unfortunately, they don't have that information, and they're still going off of old myths, like, if I put Dr. Pepper in my vagina, it'll terminate my pregnancy. You know, I still hear that from older people. Um, and then peer education, I think, is super important. I think schools allowing, you know, first off, having sexual health educators come in to provide sex education is always helpful, just because sometimes teachers don't feel comfortable teaching the curriculum themselves. And then also, it's nice to have a guest speaker have these conversations. And then also peer education is super important. We had a peer education class at NACA, the Native American Community Academy here in Albuquerque. And so we were teaching sex ed to the high schoolers, and then they were building their own sexual health curriculum to teach to their peers. And then also they were able to chime in whenever, any kind of locker room talk was happening. They could be like, well, actually, you could use a condom, or, you can get tested here. So having that knowledge is super important. But unfortunately, schools do have to abide by policies and laws for their state. And luckily, New Mexico is pretty loose when it comes to sex ed. But I know like places like Nevada, they they really just can't do sex ed at all in schools with minors.
Yeah. Something that you guys touched on that I wanted to like bring up, especially in the sense of like why maybe when it comes to sex ed like curriculum, how there's like a lack of community involved, is that I just don't feel like schools provide like a safe space really to talk about that. I mean, with policies kind of restricting some language in different states, like it's literally just kind of not creating this safe space. But just in like other avenues, I just don't feel like schools even provide like resources for people to talk about difficult subjects or report certain things to administration, which kind of makes it hard to build a community if everything is so like you keep it to yourself, like it's so individualistic, and it makes me wonder, is like what are some ways that we can break that down and really focus on community and focus on avenues for people to maybe report incidents or report feelings or just things that they feel like they need to get to administration. Because I feel like that's really hard. Like even for me, like when I try to get change in my school, like there's no ways. Like I don't know how to do it. Like there's no like, hey guys, you can come here, you can talk to us. So I'm just wondering, like, what are some ways schools can maybe work towards that? I know it's a difficult one.
It's tough. Um, Sam, yeah, do you want to go?
Okay. I don't have my thoughts all the way formed either, but I think two things. One is just acknowledging that reporting doesn't serve everybody. I think that sometimes it actually harms the person who's doing the report. And so, how do we make sure that people have support regardless of reporting? Oftentimes, that's how I get support is I have to report A and then I can get B. And so for me, that's part of it is just how are we providing broad support, period. So a young person can get their needs met without having to have experienced harm first, or without having to worry that whoever they're talking to is then going to make a report because of mandatory reporting. So that's one of the things for me is just figuring out how do we actually just provide support broadly. I don't know if y'all are into statistics around it, but how many schools actually have counselors and social workers and the people that can be there that can just talk about whatever is going on. That for me is huge. It's just general mental health and support throughout a school community, because then it builds a culture where behavior isn't allowed, where we're checking each other and not just the students, but the adults are checking each other as well. I think the other piece to me to create an environment of where what I heard where people feel like community is honestly being direct about how there's not. I think sometimes schools want to act like they're doing the work, but saying we're not there yet. We haven't done the work. We still have more room to grow. I think coming in with that mindset will open the door for people to give suggestions and not feel like they're going to get shut down. But you have to know that there's work to be done and agree that there's work to be done and then be willing to do it.
Yeah, and I feel that, teachers, administrations, there's probably a different pay range, but I think teachers are also just burnt out and don't get paid enough, to, I mean, if you're not getting paid enough, then I feel like you're not really involved with the work that you're doing, unfortunately. And I feel that there's a lot of burnout in the education system too. But I also agree that, schools need to have access to health centers. And I think that's a really great segue into the student-based health centers that are at some of the high schools in Albuquerque. I think if students don't feel safe with their administration, they can definitely go to a school-based health center where there's counselors, where they can get an STI test, where they can get Plan B, where they can get birth control, and then also just get seen if anything's happening to them. Um, I'm pretty sure they do have to do mandatory reporting, but I feel like the school-based health centers are more accessible and have more resources with what kind of, mental health resources are available in Albuquerque. I feel like they know how to handle a person in crisis, especially a youth in crisis, versus, even a principal. Um, I feel like they handle the admin part. The school-based health center are strictly there for the mental health and the physical well-being of a young person at those schools.
Mm-hmm.
Becki, could you actually list some of those like resources?
Yeah,
Because
I
I'm just
could.
like curious.
Do you want me to email it or put it in the? I'll email it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could do
um,
that. Definitely.
And I think
and
it's
also,
important to learn your policy because some school-based health centers are, I have never heard of one giving Plan B. Like, so even just like what it does it look like in your school? What does it look like in your state of what they allow them to do? And how they can be supports. Because I am not from here, but I'm actually lived most of my adult life in Nebraska. And we had school-based health centers, but they weren't allowed to provide condoms. So they can talk to you about these options, but they couldn't physically give you anything. It had to refer you out. So just learning a little bit about what do school-based health centers do? What don't they do? What can they do because of the policies in your state versus the policies in a different state? Unfortunately, that's the way we live sometimes is state to state. And I would say even city to city. I know that's true here around comprehensive sex ed is school by school and things like that.
Yeah. New Mexico, though, the school-based health centers, they do offer condoms. I'm not sure if they prescribe Plan B, if you have to go pick it up, but they can prescribe birth control. And if students are scared of them reporting to the parents, they do pull, if you do have family insurance, they will bill the insurance, but they won't call the parents. And unless you're a parent that's really looking at your insurance bill, they should. The school-based health centers are there to help you. Or if you don't have any money, yeah.
Right.
thank you. It really seems like the best way to create more of an accepting environment is kind of like bring in someone who studies this or like who knows more about it, because like if we put all the work on the teachers, that's just not fair. And if we put all the work on the administration, I mean, like, do we really believe they're gonna do much? So that kind of is sad. But I also think it's good because it provides this like community support. It's like, okay, this group came in, so now I know I can come to this group and talk about X, Y, and Z and build this thing.
Right.
So
I
I
think
just thought those.
after school groups too are very helpful in advocating for needs that are not being met by schools too, um, and requesting funds to like host events too. I've seen schools do that so that, I don't know, that might be helpful too. Or fundraising to build funds for speakers, outside speakers to come out.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great idea. I do want to pivot a little bit, I guess, talking more into education and like maybe in ways that like sexism affects people academically. Um, that's a question I have. It's just like, how does sexism slash misogyny affect maybe students' performance, if you know about that, or like, or maybe
they're doing it about the Crown Act protects people to wear their natural hair at school and anywhere. And I won't get into his whole case, but what I found interesting from all the information that they provided, it said that on average, girls are missing a week of school a year because of dress code violations. So they're being sent home to change, they're being sent out to change, whatever that looks like is different from school to school. But 1 week is a lot of school. Like we know that. This research has shown that. So to me, that's where it plays in academically is literally just missing out on school because someone wants you to change your clothes or whatever. I think the other thing I'll say that I've seen more to me is just how we fit into clubs, how we think about who's going to have this role or that role. And it's interesting when you go and you do a poll at all the clubs, who's the secretary in the club? Who's the president? Like all of these roles in our school clubs are saying something. And oftentimes when you're applying to college or you're applying for internships or wherever is next for you, you're identifying what are those roles that you held? What were the activities that you were involved in school? And so I think it also hurts you for that next stage if you are looking to go into college to say like, oh, I didn't have this role or that role because those roles are reserved for boys, even if they don't say that. The last thing I'll say, I would love to do research. I do not have the funds, but I would love to do research on how many schools the principal's a man, statistically, when we know the whole workforce of teachers are majority women, when we know a majority of the workforce are people of color, but how many of them are in the principal? How many of them are in our superintendent? And that's showing academically for students what the highest bar is. At the top are men, at the top are white men. That's what you're telling a student is what achievement looks like. It's restricted if you hold certain identities. And that is something kids see right away. They notice that in kindergarten, the diversity of the teaching staff.
This is tough. I would say, you have a point with academically, I think on top of trying to like grow academically at school, I think another thing that is on girls' minds is again social media. I think that that plays a big role in kind of just being not fully involved, right, in the curriculum, in the education. I think that there's so many exterior things that are just bombing women and girls and femmes that it's kind of hard to concentrate during classes. And dress codes missing out for a week, that I think that's just ridiculous. And then I think to add on top of that too, just the I think it was, I don't know if it was rural, and I think it was like a Navajo Nation. I had a meeting with like a Diva Cup company, and they wanted to give me Diva Cups to hand out to Navajo Nation. It was weird. It was a little white savory, but so they were saying that girls were also missing classes due to their periods, their menstrual cycles as well. And
Mhm.
girls had to go back and change. They didn't bring an extra pair of pants. That's happened to me at school in high school one time. Is I bled through my everything down there, and I had to go home and I had to miss school. And then also just cramps too. I think that you know women are finally like actually taking the time out to deal with their pain and to acknowledge like, hey, this is happening to me right now, I can't concentrate. And I think that's super important. And I don't think that we're just treated so, like, I guess, like all the same, that they don't realize that there's different hormones that female bodies go through, and we should acknowledge that as well. um I forgot, I also had another. part that I wanted to bring up. Yeah, that's all I have so far.
I
But
think, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, I think too, you know, growing up, um, being in a band, I've been playing music since I was younger. I was a punk when I was in high school. And being a girl in a band, I still feel the sexism. You know, you don't see a lot of Native women who are in punk bands or just in the media in general. And so I think that, you know, that kind of made me not as confident as my male counterparts who are in bands. You know, I feel like I had to play hard. I have to play harder. I have to prove myself extra. I can't I can't mess up. There's just so much pressure. There's a lot of pressure. Sorry. Go ahead, Dan. Sorry.
No, you're good. I think the other subtext often is how your looks and how you do or don't fit into beauty standards aligns with how smart you are or you aren't. And so even if we're not naming that specifically as sexism, it is. It's this is the box that you're supposed to be in. If you look this way, you should have this idea about school, right? Whether you love it or hate it. And a lot of that is tied to our idea of beauty standards on who is or is not pretty, therefore, who does or does not have to be a good student. And that goes beyond just our female students, but I see it often with our male students and the athletes in particular. Of this, because I'm an athlete, I can't also be smart, right? Because I'm an athlete, I can't also. And really, it's just all the boxes that you are told to be in because of how you show up in one way or another. Now that means this is all the boxes, all the things I know about you. Here's the full list because I know one word or one identity.
Yeah, and I would like to add like the layer of race on top of that, and how like how your race will, yeah, will affect how people see you. Like I know growing up as a black girl, like it, I don't think a lot of times people see me as like academic or like a nerd or something like that along those lines. And I feel a lot of times like I get overlooked, or certain clubs, like you were talking about clubs and different extracurriculars, don't reach out, or like they're not advertised towards me. And I think that's really sad, even if I'm like really interested in it. Um, yeah, sorry, I got like detoured on that. But I do think that when you present in a certain body, you're going to get treated differently based on how you fall into like a hierarchy, really. And
Mhm.
I think that's just tragic. But I guess my question is, what are some ways we could start breaking down that hierarchy? I know that's like a big question, but like within schools, like are there anything, or is there anything that schools can do to start breaking down that like barrier or wall, or reaching out to people?
I think gender studies is very helpful in recognizing and having critical conversations around sexism. And I think a history too of like different movements that have happened in the past around sexism, right? You know, women's movements, um, the American Indian movement, um, you know, what kind of different political affiliations people are involved with, and how did they progress different genders. I think that's super helpful, and it's just not brought up in school curriculums. At least I don't think so. Not until you're in college, usually.
Yeah.
Right. I think there's a couple things. I think the first one is just to listen. So, what are people actually experiencing in your school? I do love research, even though if I don't want to do it. But there's a really interesting article, and it was like they interviewed principals about their school, and then they interviewed the teachers and then the students. And how much reality was there of what the principal thought was happening in their school versus what the teachers thought were happening in their school versus what the students know is happening in the school. And so I think a big part of it is just listening to your students because you're not going to hear about everything. I've seen some students do some great senior projects. I had one of my students back home. I used to run a youth advisory board, and they did it on like, do students want comprehensive sex ed? And they did interviews with the students and they presented that. I've seen kids push back on the dress code and wear the same outfit and see that their black friend is the one that gets in trouble and the white friend doesn't. But it's hard sometimes for people to really notice those things because it's not in their job, right? Like I don't go in and hear the little side conversations kids are having. Just literally this school year, I was sitting at a flag football game at a school I worked at, and I heard two kids talking about two other kids in the seventh grade sending back nudes back and forth. That's not something that principal's going to know. But the students know what's happening, right? It has to get to a certain point of concern before others are hearing about it. And so to me, the first step is just listening to your students. What are they saying that's happening? And then investigate some more. Like, is this something every student is experiencing? Because what makes one student feel safe might undermine the safety of another student. And our priority should be on the most marginalized students in our school buildings. So those would be the things I think ultimately starting listening, writing down, getting feedback. What would you want it to look like if you could control it, right? And hearing what students think about what's going on. And also, I would say what teachers think as well, because sometimes teachers are between a rock and a hard place, wanting to support their students and having to deal with admin, even if they're the most loving teachers that can be. That's just the reality of being inside a broken system, is you have to pick your side.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely think there's a disconnect a lot of times with school between like students, teachers, and admin. Like it's almost like they're on three different or going to three different schools, which is so weird to think about. But yeah, it goes back to like schools providing places for students to maybe not report, but just simply just share how they're feeling and just like talk about the school and like things you notice and just share their thoughts, perspective without it being a report or almost like weaponized against that student. Because I feel like that
Mm-hmm.
also happens a lot. But I have one final question. If you could like give advice to a student, a teacher, or an admin about fighting sexism in school, what would be your main advice? I know you guys been giving a lot of like great tips, so not to overlook that, but if you could be like, you can start this today.
It's all the things, right? So I'm like, what's the maybe one or two things? I'll tell you one that I think of is, how do you let your teachers just show up as themselves? Because if your teachers are feeling restricted, your students are too. So being able to have teachers that look like your students, being able to have teachers show up as their authentic selves in whatever way that looks like, promotes an environment where kids and students feel like they can also show up authentically. And so for me, that's the first step, is authenticity of people. And that looks like not just, we all know the flyers, right? That have checked all the boxes. That's not authenticity if it's only one school and that poor kid is, whatever. That's a whole nother story for another day. But think about the ways that diversity and inclusion look beyond the boxes. So, who is actually helping you do that work every day? Because it's not just a 1 day professional development, it's not just a 2 hour training, it's every day. And how are you reflecting back every day? And one of the ways you see that are people leaving your school. Just the turnover rate for different groups of people can show you that sexism is there. But I think oftentimes when you are in a marginalized group, and I'll say for myself, doubly marginalized as a Black woman, you've built up a tolerance for stuff. And so just because you're there doesn't mean the place is healthy. And so really thinking about, how are you having people show up authentically? How are you promoting authenticity in what people say, what they don't say? And the other thing I'd mention that I feel like is the lowest of bars, but how you refer to people. Language is so important. And it's oftentimes what I hear is what teachers are referred to as Miss or Mr. and what teachers are referred to as doctor, or what teachers are referred to by just their first name, and the ways that you're showing power dynamics and the language that you're choosing to use when you're referring to other people. And students will see that. I've seen that even in a classroom with a teacher as they called on student A versus student B. Oh, what does the scholar have to say, right? Versus, oh, Becki, what do you have to add? Like, all of the language that we use is also promoting sexism. So thinking about the language and promoting an environment where people can show up authentically, those to me are the two biggest things.
I think that's perfect. I think showing up authentically also just gives you more room in your head, right? To absorb what you're at school for, which is to get your education. Um, Dang, that's scary about teachers are saying like, going and thinking back to when I was in school, I can definitely and it was like a racist school. They would like say like, "Oh, chief, what about you?" I'm sure that's still happening too. But yeah, definitely language. I think teachers need to be not need to be, but I feel like as sex educators too, we have to kind of be up to date with what's happening in our current time. I think especially with pop culture, what are the students listening to? What are the students into right now? I think that's super helpful in building trust and relationships too with young people so that they can, feel like they have a place to be authentic. And I feel like there's just always that kind of generational disconnect. And I think too, I'm on the board for a school in Navajo Nation called Deep Distiglo'i. And so I'm thinking back to those teachers. I'm thinking about how it's amazing to have a school that is catering to the culture of the community, right? So we're also learning how to speak our language. We're also learning the history of Diné people. We're not just learning about American history, but I think that would also be really cool too. New Mexico is like learning the specific history around New Mexico. How did it come to be a state? And I think just, going back to the research, like Sam, like what are the trends right now in New Mexico, especially for young people? And I think curriculum and doing homework or, projects around that is super important. So students are also up to date. And I think I really like doing capstones, which is like students getting college credits too while they're still in high school. I think that's really great. And I think, promoting girls to go into STEM. I feel like there's always promotion for that at universities. Pushing that and still continuing that push for women to strive for higher education. And it's great that women are in the education field, but again, it is teacher field. It's not usually management positions or supervisor positions. But thinking, I can do a lot more. And my voice, my experience being a woman, my experience being a Black or brown woman is very vital to the research that I'm doing. And so I think that, that's kind of what I want to push for students, especially young women and femmes.
Can I add one more thing Becki made me think about? I'm a nerd and I love door decorations. I love billboard, bulletin board contests, all that kind of stuff. And what would it look like if that was just about women the entire school year? Like, how do we learn about all of these women in history? Because the reality of it is, they did a lot of work that no one ever hears about. And so, to me, one of the things that can look like, which isn't, yes, the curriculum needs to change, but also what is in our physical environment that can change. I'm part of Black Lives Matter at School National, and we made one of the options for people to do celebrate Black women was to name, what have Black women in your city done? Like, not just in history, but what's happening in your local city. There are women leading in your local city. There are femmes leading in your local city. And so asking young people not only about history and the ways that women have been powerful there, but in the day to day, they're doing the work and they're not being noticed for that because there's a man's name in front of theirs, or because people just don't want to honor the work that women do, if we're being honest. So I think that's another piece is, what is the imagery around your school building? Oftentimes it's all the previous principals and presidents and all these things that are male dominated instead of engaging with all the women. And I think right now, with everything happening, I'm also thinking about Two Spirit and the ways that we really show broad gender and how it shows up outside of the United States and within it.
And women in your household too. I feel like it's very much unpaid labor, that the jobs that mothers and aunties and grandmothers do. Um, you know, thinking about, I mean, it's exploitative work, but yeah, it's a different conversation. But be thankful for also the women and where you come from. I think that's super important.
I'm loving all this advice, and I think this is very practical and just like will help every environment, just simply with like bulletin boards with information. It would just, I feel, brighten up the school. Uh, but yeah, thank you for all the advice. That's all the questions I have. I'm so grateful that you guys took time out your day to come and talk to me and actually like answer my questions and, give me great comments and advice and just information. Now I want to like go home and, well, I guess I'm home, but like take it and share with other people. So yes, thank you again.